I think this is visible. I'm putting it on
now
full screen mode. Okay.
Yeah.
So very good morning to everybody. Welcome all to this very, very important discussion today. And this is a very, I would say, a very significant co-learning session that we are having as part of our program. And today we will be talking about society, culture, environment, and sustainability at large. So actually we are trying to understand how society and culture interfaces with sustainability. First of all, to just begin our understanding of what a society is. Okay, so the general description we all know and we experience as being part of a society is that it is a large group of people who live together, sharing common tasks and making some decisions about how the lifestyle and the activities related to their lifestyles should function. So the Cambridge dictionary definition is given here, but how do we think about what a society is given very beautifully by Heyer in 2005. He says that what connects the contemporary theory to the long history of social thought spanning Socrates to Weber and beyond is a shared interest in understanding and explaining the characteristics and features of human group life. So this is a very interesting way to understand what a society is. So there is a shared interest in understanding as well as explaining the characteristics, and also in the process facilitating and adopting these practices as part of a group life. And this is what I think best suits as a definition for society. Today, actually, let us, before we go into other comprehensive discussions, let us start by looking at some very nice photographs of landscapes, resources, and their interactions with humans. So the first photograph, I think, which is displayed on your screens, is what is known as the Paro Taksang, or the tiger's nest. And this is a monastery, a Buddhist monastery, which is located in Bhutan, which is also known as the world's happiest nation. Now, just I would like to share a few experiences of my own with Bhutan. I have visited Bhutan as a child when my father was deputed there to work at the Chuka hydropower project. And the experience has stayed with me throughout my life here. I've experienced the beauty of nature at its best, I would say, the landscape, the mountainscape, the pristineness of those forests, the pristineness of the people there itself, who are really very happy. I would attest to that fact, because their connections with nature and the way in which they styled their lives around nature was something really worth imbibing. Although I did not realize it at that point in time as a child, but I think those experiences have stayed on with me, and I think it's a very good part of my education which my parents have been able to give me. And I can assure you that the connection with nature is something that defines what life is, but at the same time, the human connections with nature is what also impact these beautiful landscapes. As I told you, you can see here, actually, this is actually a seat of, it's also a religious seat of Vajrayana Buddhism, which was brought to Bhutan by the Bodhisattva Padmasambhava as per the history. And even a cursory look at the Wikipedia page, which talks about the Paru Taksang, gives a very comprehensive note of the history of this place. But I would like us to look at in detail the surrounding landscape where this has been built, and how much of the beauty, the culture, is also surrounded by the kind of isolation that this place is, right? So this is actually a functional space for a religion that is understood. I'm not a practicing Buddhist, but I can tell that any religion would, place great stress upon peace, upon knowledge sharing in circumstances where it is possible for such knowledge co-creation and sharing to happen. So here also you see it is surrounded by a beautiful natural environment, which actually is very, very important in the way in which this knowledge sharing or gathering and preservation happens for a very, very long time. So moving on and talking about knowledge sharing, this photograph, okay, brings us to a very urban setting, very different from what we had seen earlier. Here you see this is a congregation of minds and a space for such congregation, which was built by individuals in an urban structure to record and for posterity record these experiences, the human experiences, the social experiences, the environmental experiences and whatnot, from science to social science to knowledge. So here, this Kannimara Library, this picture of Kannimara Library in Chennai is one of a very prized group of libraries of national repute, where all books, newspapers, magazine, whatsoever is printed in India finds its way here as a copy. It is published and it is deposited here. That which is, it was established long back, so it is also has a history of its own, and also that it acts as a depository library for United Nations is a very prestigious tag for this particular library. But here you see again there is a human and a society interaction happening within a space which was created by humans to experience knowledge in a different way. So this actually is a very important experience. I have been to Kannimara as well, and I can't tell you how inspiring it is to just sit here and look at the multitudes of books. The people, actually, you can keep looking at people, how they read these books, what sort of books they select, what sort of, they are not just books, there are records, there are historical records, the ancient records. So you see people in different phases of activity, looking and gathering at knowledge in very specific ways, in their own ways, in very different forms as well. And this very picture is something more practical, which pulls us closer to life as we know it. And this is a suburb called Borivali in Mumbai. It's a station, a railway station. You can see it's jam-packed. It is in a peak hour situation. This particular suburb is actually a congregate area, which consists of smaller towns, which were segregated and I would say aggregated rather together to form what is known as Borivali. And it is actually proximally located to a mountain called Poinsur, and it's placed strategically between two rivers, the Hisar and Poisar. And there is a very, very important historical edifice here, a cave edifice found at Manpeshwar. And connected to this is also a very important forest area, which is designated as a national park, Sanjay Gandhi National Park. And this area, if we see, has so much of history, culture, and being at the suburb of Mumbai, it's somewhat placed at I would say it is actually a place which contributes human force or workforce for all the happenings that a society wishes to have in a big city like Mumbai, and it facilitates these kinds of social processes. So this particular snapshot tells us that there is no dearth of workforce, there is no dearth of the people who are ready to accept these standards of life and ways of life and lifestyles, and also contribute in their own specific ways to the environment. And very metaphorically, it is called Borivali because it's actually, Bor means berries in Marathi, and as a congregation of towns and also congregation of so many people, it cannot be more metaphorical as it sounds. And this particular picture is very reflective of that very situation. So if we look at this from a different perspective, we all know that there are three states of matter: the vapor state, the liquid state, and the gaseous state. If we look at the vapor state, we know that in the molecules which constitute this vapor state, they are actually, largely loosely connected, and they have some linear or unidirectional relationships in between them once in a while. So there is a concept of isolation, but there is also a concept of connectivity. And that connectivity, although it is distant, it is actually directional. It is also can be linear. So, but the level of interactions, if you see, is going to change when there are constituents, the molecules or the atoms which make up this particular space, vapor-like space, are distant apart. But if we come to a liquid-like phase, if taking this corollary forward, we know that any sort of organization would be a multilinear organization, a multi-directional organization. And because the organization and the networking itself is both multilinear and multi-directional, the impact of these communications and these associations tends to be a little more fluid, but also solid in one sense, right? So there is actually sharing which is taking place in multiple directions, but there is also the forces exerted upon each of their constituents in a fashion that keeps a check on each other in a much easier way compared to the vapor-like state. But in a solid state, if we see, the interactions tend to be mostly multi-directional, but very random. And we cannot accept this so easily because we tend to see that there is a compactness in a solid space where, you would expect situations to be very, very directional. But it is proven by science and in otherwise also that randomness does exist even in this sort of organization. If we compare this with the societies, the human societies and the photographs which showed us the different settings of nature versus the human societies as we have come forward, we can understand that the status of network can be distal in the vapor-like state, or a medial position as in the liquid state, or a proximal position. And here, three considerations matter quite much. One is the consideration of what is the personal space which is available for humans who constitute these spaces. Second consideration is what is, as a community, what is the space that they have, and what is the space that they can actually share. And the third consideration is the ecosystem space that these organisms, rather human beings, they occupy, and how this has actually led to the way in which they communicate with each other, and in the way that I should say that, in the way that we look at this in a multiple dimension, and in the way that the resource availability caters to the way in which these societies themselves shape up. So that is actually what we look at from the angle of a human society, the perspectives of human society, and it very much correlates with the way that we actually see human societies. Now, if we look at human society as a whole, there are certain characteristics that we should understand about. Now, here you see there are 6 different characteristics which are shown in this graph. Let us go one by one. The first characteristic is that human society originates and is native and bounded to particular geographic space. This can be in the form of a natural barrier, or it can be in the form of artificial barriers, such as, say, for example, we have state borders, we have, country borders. So these are actually man-made or artificial boundaries. And there are also natural boundaries, such as the forests, such as, the water bodies and other streams, which contribute in a major way to where a society belongs to. So the identity, it caters to this identity of where a society belongs to. The second thing that we come across is that the human societies themselves undergo social processes, right? The social processes can be in the form of traditions, can be in the form of customs or values and aptitudes, which is very essential for us to understand, because these social processes in a way shape how this society is going to function. So who makes these traditions, customs are the society itself, and the society itself evolves values, and it evolves aptitudes and attitudes for creating certain task flow or the workflow, and also able to execute this. So these traditions, customs, values, attitudes, aptitudes are all the social processes that a human society undergoes. So then if we see another important characteristic is that there is a commonality or an identity which actually functions as a dominant force within a society, which actually influences the practices that a society takes forth and also how it shapes its own history. It is very easy for us to understand that certain practices, there is a difference between traditions, customs, and practices, because the practices what they talk about is in terms of contemporary practices or contemporary workflow, whereas when we look at traditions or customs, it's more a matter of how things have been carried forth from earlier times or the historical times to what is in the present time. So there is a continuity there. There is a connection between the people who lived earlier or before us and the people who live after us. This is very specific to the human society. And the practices it takes up is based much on the content of the traditions, the values, and the aptitude systems, as well as what is prevalent right now. Okay, the atmosphere that is prevalent right now. So history and practices give or complete the identity that a human society assumes. The next aspect or the characteristic of a human society is in the way of its cultural content. And each society is very, very specific in the way it develops this cultural content. And this actually forms a major part of its identity, or builds rather on that identity, and strongly places it despite the geographic borders or the the natural and the artificial borders. It places them in the context of culture, in the context of the cultural content they put forth to the human society at large. Also the way in which a society adapts, also the way in which it coexists with others, and the way in which it tolerates the other societies, these are all building up on the identity or a characteristic of a society itself. The next very important aspect which shapes all these four or five things that we have seen till now is the hierarchy that the society establishes. So every society is known to be hierarchical, although in modern times the concept of democracy actually defies this hierarchy system to some extent. There is still a hierarchy which is present in terms of the power relationships and in terms of the authority that each strata of the society yields. And this is very, very specific to the trophic levels that we have learnt about at an ecosystem level. We actually can identify with the hierarchical structure that is present in a human society. And this hierarchical structure, along with the power and the authority structures, actually govern the society at large, based on the multiple identities that are present within a given a geographical space. So here the concept of rules, regulations, and norms also characterize a human society, which actually evolves these rules and regulations through its association with tradition, values, systems, the practices, and the histories, as also its cultural content. But also it also dictates to the society how it has to function. So here the functional aspect or the functional identity sets in. Next, when we say it, every human society has this functional differentiation based on its social structure and its cultural and process wise organizations. So here we can see that this hierarchical classification is complete in the form of division of labor. So each part of the population can contribute to some sort of labor, which actually promotes the growth and well-being of a society. This is the basic element that a human society practices. And this functional differentiation is very much an inherent characteristic which helps us to achieve this objective of division of labor and specialization in certain cases to achieve what the human society wishes to achieve, that is growth. But there are n degrees of institutional complexity which are associated when the people experiences and the life experiences come together, right? So by people experiences, we say that it is collective experience and life experience is more an individual experience. When this come about, there is a contextuality element in which these social processes, these interactions and the structuring and functionalities evolve in time. And to understand this, we actually have to understand that society actually can be defined in terms of its epistemology, that is a way in which knowledge and truth is actually manufactured in a way and also processed in a way, how truth is actually leading to the ethical considerations, and how knowledge plus truth together help a society to have its judgments and activities in place. So another very important and connected stream is the axiology, or the study of the values that a human society has, and it's characterized by this because the value system actually, if we are actually building on from values to knowledge and truth in this aspect, because knowledge dictate the way in which the values dictate the way in which the knowledge should be used, and values dictate the way in which truth is established in a society. It is very important, truth as I would say a normalizing factor in human society, so that the knowledge production is also sincere and useful to the society itself. So this axiology, actually a stream of sociology, helps us to study these value systems in place. And another important field, ontology, deals with the being itself, how the individuals of a society look at themselves and how they function, because every unit of a society is important. Every unit that brings forth the progress and brings forth the experiences, knowledge and truth components is very important building components of any society. So in that way, if we see, the ontology of this society is a very, very important consideration, which also indicates how the society will have its judgments and how it will function in the form of the collective activities that a society wants to undertake. So now we have discussed the characteristics of a human society and its functionalities, how in different dimensions these functionalities are attributed. So why do we need a society, and why do we need this functionality? So that is very important thing for us to understand as well, because the goals of a society are, number one, to observe and participate as part of the sociological processes itself. The second is to translate these experiences and as a part of the societal trends, and also evolve into another sphere or another layer, which is better than the lower layer. So this sort of evolution is also a very critical part or a characteristic of a society, which is defined as its goal. The third important goal is to use this evolution and experience to progress and develop into what are known as a harmonious society, so that everybody is benefited to be a part of this society. Here you see science and technology play a major role in facilitating these goals of societies, especially in terms of the sociological processes and its outcomes. But culture is a very important factor which will determine how what is the direction in which these goals are attained. Because culture actually is we can define culture rather as a phenomenon which operationalizes the social knowledge that a society actually has accumulated. And culture is what provides a social context to issues. So actually a society, there are several human societies around the world, and each society can have its own goals, although on the whole these three goals will be common to all societies. The way in which they achieve it can be very, very different, but these the means in which they are achieved should not disturb the functionalities of other human societies. In that aspect, culture actually brings a social context to global and regional issues. For example, looking at anthropology in detail, looking at the psychological aspects, The historical and the creative arts will give a context to which a particular issue is placed within a society. Hardly any issue is an issue by itself. It is actually an amalgamation of how the individuals or a community has gone through a specific set of experiences in the form of a collective psychology that it brings forth, its own history and cultural practices, as we have seen the tradition and cultural practices, and how creatively it is able to solve these issues. So this is what is actually known as operationalizing, and culture is considered as an operationalizing mechanism of the social knowledge that a society accumulates or has aggregated over several generations. Now if we see that, having understood what is society and what is culture, we see that there are specific disciplines of approach to culture which is very, very essential for us to understand, and under the three different headings here: the anthropological angle, the sociological and psychological angles, as well as the history and the arts angle. So for example, if we take anthropology, anthropology actually details the way in which a human society will influence the observation of the processes that a society undergoes. So deals with the participant observation, which also is similar to what we call in the natural sciences side as field note taking or recording what is actually happening in the society. And here actually the importance of the very specific and context placed interpretation of culture becomes very essential for us to understand what are the observations or the sociological processes that are taking place within a given society. If we take the psychological angle and the sociological angle, it is very interesting. Now we have observations and we have interpretations of why these observations are happening. But sociology helps us to understand how these relationships are formed and how they will be reproduced. So there is a distinct, we all tend to think, usually people from the science stream do not have a very good understanding of how the social sciences merge with the scientific stream in different categories. And here it is very essential now for us to understand that anthropology looks at it in a different, helps us to look at it in a different way, whereas the sociology and psychology are very different ways to look at this as well. Now, the sociological angle, like I said, coming back, tells us how the relationships between the sociological parameters happen and how they will be reproduced, okay, and why they are reproduced and how they will be taken forth in the future as well. So this is a very important question that any sociologist will ask based on the data that the anthropologist brings to the table. They can say why they are formed and how they will be reproduced. But we also need to associate this with the psychological dimension, which helps us to understand why these are being formed and how they will be reproduced. Because it is, as I said, the complexity increases in a society where the life experiences and the collective experiences come together. There is always, a certain element of unpredictability or uncertainty. And psychology actually is a very important field which sort of transcends these fields to understand why those uncertainty come about and how best we can be able to understand those in the present or in the historical context. Another going forward, the historical context, the talk takes us to the tradition of the documentary analysis, which is part of the historical process itself. So now we are looking at a phenomenon at present. We are actually aware that this phenomenon is happening. There is, say, an unsustainable practice which is happening. So we need the historian to tell us through documentary evidences or looking at documents which were produced as knowledge products in the earlier or historical times, tell us that this practice was not present earlier and it has been a formulation in modern times. Whereas it can be a contrasting situation when a historian says, oh, this has been the practice which has been followed since the medieval ages. So that is a different kind of an interpretation of a circumstance. So here the sociological process then will say how this were formed and how they are going to be reproduced in future. Whereas the psychological part will help us to understand the human behavior which led to the sociological processes. So the contemporary records of personal testimony, which also form a part of the history, are very, very well connected to the anthropological data sets that come in the way of observations and in way of interpretation of the cultures themselves. So also the creative arts, they actually are very good ways to document history in the way of tradition of the aesthetics, how it is actually, even in the absence of any written records or any physical records, they are transmitted from one human society to another and from one community to another and between communities or within communities and within generations or between generations. So here actually the tradition of transmission through creative art keeps alive the ways or the multitude of ways in which values and form judgments were assessed and formed actually through the ages. So here the disciplines of societal approach towards culture, namely the anthropological, sociological, psychological, historical, and the creative arts components, these all together form the basic sociological process through which a society experiences what it has gone through, records it, assesses it, evaluates it, and tries to derive some useful information from this experience. So now actually what is happening is that the process doesn't stop here, because the culture element of culture in the society, it assumes a higher dimension of understanding. It is not just the knowledge assimilation that we are looking at present and noting down what happened earlier, how a society has gone through certain periods in time. Was it due to the availability or non-availability of the resources? How the individual, the community, and the ecosystem spaces were shared and how they were unshared, or what were the conflicts that a society went through, and how the resource availability, whether it dictated the way in which a society was shaped in terms of its other milestones, such as the education, the tradition, the culture, did that actually influence the way in the ways in which the society understood what was happening to it. So herein comes the importance of what is known as cognition. So any human society has an elementary cognition of the sociological processes it undergoes, but this translates into higher awareness in due course of time, where more data becomes available and more methods to assess this data become available. When there are also tools that a society develops to interpret these data sets in the best possible way, we can come to a higher level of functioning, which is known as appropriate reaction. Starting from the elementary cognition to appropriate reaction, we can term what is known as a psychological process or a psycho cultural process known as consciousness. Okay, so the consciousness, the higher consciousness leads a society to transition. Here we see a very important point that we have to understand. The first point is there are always individual layers and a societal or a community level layer of analysis of information. Okay, it is very different in ways that an individual assesses the situation, takes in the experiences, and reacts to it. And there is this, the individual cognition is very different from a community cognition or a societal cognition. Here the societal cognition, although it can in a metaphorical sense say that it is summative of all the individual cognition, it may or not reflect the same state of individual cognition on the whole, right? So a collective of individuals can come up with a decision which is very different from what an individual decides on his or her own. Why are we studying this or concentrating on this factor? Because this is a very essential factor in the way that sustainability is perceived in individual ways as well as a community or a societal way. Example I've given here is, what is water usage in individual opinion can be very different from water usage from a social opinion or a community level opinions, right? So we can actually, while we brush our teeth, we can open our tap and we can say that we are using water. But on a societal scale, on a community scale, when we look at it, it will be it termed as water wastage, because the amount that we are using for undertaking one particular task can be shared by many such individuals to accomplish the same task. So here actually the cognition has developed from an elementary level to a community level. Here the cognition is of a higher degree, because we also assess the ways in which the individuals relate to natural resources versus how a community relates to natural resources. So here actually how this can happen is through culture itself, because culture will lay down the values, as we have seen, will lay down the grounds and the understanding in which we can perceive a community level cognition as very important context for sustainability rather than an individual context. So here the role of culture is to provide correct, unbiased context for the progress of the society or societal progress. Hence, culture and society are very, very important parts of what we come to know as a sustainable development prerogative. And here, culture can actually, in a very conservative as well as in a non-conservative way, linear as well as in a non-linear way, contribute to this understanding or evolution of the consciousness. When we look at the dimensions itself of how this consciousness develops, first, we start from observation, then it develops into analysis, and then that transforms into assessment. So here, actually, culture provides the framework for real life and real time sociological awareness. I say real life because we are going to discuss about this in the last few slides, but there can be also synthetic understanding of a situation, okay, which is actually based on certain facts that the history provides or which is documented, but it may not be applicable to a real life situation. Also, this is happening in real times. Culture as a space gives for these real time processes and sets the framework within which the observation, analysis, and assessment will help to drive the overall progress, societal progress initiative over real time, in the real time rather. So the over the real cycle of these observation, analysis, assessment trends, what comes forth is what are known as scenario. So a scenario, an analysis of scenario is also something that is culturally possible. For example, we can term it as a knowledge production initiative, or it can be a creative art initiative, or a co-production between the knowledge and the creations. So here, the scenario analysis can also account for not just the present experiences, but also the past experiences, and bring forth actually an understanding of how human judgments can change given different contexts. So there's a contextual element associated with the scenario analysis, which a culture actually develops and gives space to analyze. Once the space is given, the formation of the judgment values and the context itself actually refines. So the refinement in this actually takes place by innovative assessment strategies, as well as formulating innovative management methods, which actually tells us how close the society was to achieve its goals, or how far away or far placed it was or ill placed it was to achieve those goals. So a culture is not just documenting all that is nice and good and rosy in a human society, but it is also rather a narrative largely of the failures of human society, of the ways in which the scenarios associated with resource usages and human resources, the landscape, and how they have come together, that has failed in many different ways. So that is actually knowledge production in itself. Culture actually gives this knowledge production dimension to the society as a whole, and helps in facilitating the process of transformation by Number one, giving empirical assessment of the factors, as we have just discussed, and recording these evidences in not just the data format, but also in the format of oral traditions, in the way of, cultural traditions, in the way in which the arts are manifested. So a weaver can have a very particular way of selecting the raw materials and weaving those raw materials together to form a specific product. And this actually opens up the space for us to assess how the natural landscape would have been for him or her to obtain these raw products and then weave the materials or the finished goods out of those raw products. So the whole process, actually, it's not just sociological process, it also integrates with the study of the natural systems, also the ecosystems, and how the ecosystems were used by the humans in one particular period of time. So here the oral traditions and the craftsmanship, which is transmitted from one generation to another generation, the skill, the transfer of skill, and the work transfer, those are all basic aspects of recording the evidence in the form of data and in the form of oral traditions. So here, because culture does not take a very strict way in which these data are stored, it has the form flexibility to document the practices of civilization. So actually, there is a Mayan calendar which uses, beads and very different way of recording time. So that is a tradition, something that was very easy, practice that was put into very useful interpretations of time in the earlier periods. But now it is completely lost because present society cannot identify with the materials or the logic in which these data were produced. But we understand through our study of history and through very intense sociological research that these were mediums in ways in the way in which time was actually understood, or time was actually deciphered by an earlier civilization. So there are multiple pathways and processes that a cultural system or a social system can adopt to understand what is happening and also transmit or transform. Maybe the Mayan calendar can, trigger in one way formation of a better calendar system in the world in modern times or contemporary eras, but it may not also. So there are multiple ways or processes which can influence the way in which one generation looks at the previous or the next generation, and it moves on through time. So understanding this holistically is possible only through the socio-cultural means, and these assessments hence actually tell us where transformations are necessary, whether there has been a failure in historical times which has to be remedied, and if using modern tools and methods can help to achieve more resilience to these failures. The failure can be natural, as in case of the disasters. It can also be man-made, as in case of like a sociological disaster, in which the whole the decisions of the leaders in a society led to the wiping out of the whole communities through wars or other mechanisms. Okay, so economic disasters, wars, these are all actually man-made disasters. So the resilience to the actual societal structure and the natural landscape is a very important element which the socio-cultural studies actually bring in to the forefront. Now, if we see, we all know the story of Red Riding Hood. I'm bringing in this very big, very small story here because that's something we can identify through the ages, irrespective of our age. So, as to quickly just talk about Red Riding Hood's story, she is a small girl who's sent by her mother through a forest to reach the place where her grandmother stays at the other side of the forest to deliver some food that the mother has cooked for the grandmother, because apparently the grandmother is not keeping well. So the child is very, very happy to do that because she looks forward to this experience, and she looks forward to meeting her grandmother, going through the forest. So all these experiences excite her, and she's going through the forest. She knows that there is the other end to the forest. She's very sure of it. She's going there, and she's carrying some commodities with her, which she wants to give to the grandmother. This is in form of food here. So if we actually have a corollary to Red Riding Hood's story, where when she reaches there, she experiences the the after effects of what she would call as a wrong companionship of a wolf that she came across in the forest. Because when she went through the forest, the wolf actually talks to her, and it says to her, asks her where she's going, and she shares her story and what she wants to do. The wolf actually, in the meanwhile, unknown to her, takes a different path, reaches the grandmother's house, kills the grandmother and eats it, and it's lying, it's waiting for Red Riding Hood to reach the grandmother's place so that it can eat her as well. So here, actually, it is we can think of it as a very funny story, but it has a very rich corollary to the way in which scientific progress and development is, influencing sustainability at large. So looking at it through this story, or we can call it like a folklore, gives us an opportunity to assess the ways in which actually sustainability can be impeded by actually having a specific pathway that this child takes. So the reach of the child actually can be attributed to the way in which there was less development of technology in the industrial development stages that the human society went through. At that point in time, the knowledge production was limited to what we can call as scientific silos or specific areas of science. Here, the basket was very small. So as was Red Riding Hood's basket, but because the sciences had not progressed to such an extent which will help us to detect where anomalies were, where changes were required, and where the sociological process themselves had failed. So here the failure of the wolf to actually show compassion to this small girl and to have compassion for the human society is a very good corollary that we can attribute to the level of damage that the non-availability of scientific tools to advance sustainability could have happened in the yesteryears. Also here, if we see once the child reaches there, continuing the story, the wolf actually impersonates the grandmother and asks her to come in so that she can actually be gobbled by him. But the strategies and planning were more evasive in nature in the yesteryears, where science could not give the whole cognition or the whole multitude or magnitude of experiences as now. And it was limited to what we call as mimicking or a smoke screening principle, where pretense was actually an effective method to avoid the strategies and planning which will help to achieve a specific outcome. So here I'm not criticizing science or technology. What I'm trying to tell you is that there is a collective experience that a society actually goes through in the presence of the better tools or better technologies or better methodologies of understanding. And this very specific process, we have to understand, comes through only the cultural and the sociological processes which the society itself evolves from. Okay, so here the science did have a story to tell. The individuals had a story to tell. Each child, each Red Riding Hood that went through the forest of I would say the dark ages of science had a story to tell, but those stories were waiting for to happen. And more importantly, we see the wolf as the bad person here, or the bad creature here, but the wolf has a tail too, because it is also part of the survival or of the food chain or the food web of the forest and the human societies as a whole. And it has its own place, and it has its own demands, and it has own its rights to do what it wants. But the way in which it has achieved what it wants, That actually is very evident from the tale of Little Red Riding Hood for us to understand that the value aspects or the cultural contexts and the cultural content of a society will dictate that the wolf need not do wolf-like activities to achieve that progress. But in the modern times, if we see, we no longer have the Red Riding Hood. We have the Green Riding Hood. And it is Green Riding Hood because we are in an age where we are giving more importance to sustainable development and green thinking and green living, right? So here, if we see successively through successive evolution of human societies, we have come to realize the dominance of science and technology in our lives. So now our situation is very different from the earlier situation when science and technology did not, dominate every individual's life or community's life. Even at a societal level, it did not dominate what the individual decisions and judgments and values should be. But now everything goes through what are known as data, right? So we are actually dependent on data to form our judgments, to form our thinking and understanding. So here actually life has become evidence based for us, and these evidence based data is provided to us by science and technology. But the challenge is that even then, it has not been easy for us to decipher what lies in the forest and how the forest is composed and how we can manage it. How we can, what are the hidden dangers? How we can overcome these hidden dangers? And where are the transformations necessary for us to achieve harmony, right? So the older tools we realize will not work for us, that also have to evolve. It is no longer just the scientific tools telling us, as we come to the modern era, rather, we understand that science can be a great way to achieve, ease of living, but it cannot be the best way, right? So we need to move from unsustainable to sustainable. Here, our old tools and technologies will not work, but at the same time, we have to find the strategic tools and planning which will help us to synchronize the way in which we produce and use resources and the way in which we give back to nature. So here actually taking the form of a creative art and understanding it through the medium of a story helps us to realize in a better way, or visualize in a better way where we are standing and why sustainability is at the core of society and culture. Now, the complexity in planning sustainability is also very huge. Having spoken of, dealt through these discussions on the need for evolving of better tools and methodologies, there still remains the global challenge of competitive use of resources. Who gets to use the resource? How do we prioritize? So that is number one challenge. It's a global challenge, it's a regional challenge, it's a national and a local challenge. So here the competitive use of resources, as we have seen even in the case of water in an earlier session, it is very important that we have to let go of the aged model which says science knows all and will help us to use the resources to the maximum. Rather, it should evolve into science must know all, because now all know science, right? So nobody is untouched by science or technology in their lives, to understand that science must know how to provide the pathways to achieve sustainable use of resources. So now we are actually, the complexity is increased in the way in which we make demands as a society on the science. We make demand on the technology as a society, and we are trying to asking scientists, we are asking technologists to give us solutions for the real life situations. So here actually, the science here must push for not just one-time use of resources, but it must push for equity, intergenerational, intragenerational, and intercultural. Across the globe, the use of resources should be normalized. And it's a very big challenge. It's a very big task, and it is not easy to understand. That is why actually there is a wonderful paper by Gibbons who mentions that the challenge before us right now is to integrate what they know now with what others want to do in the future. So this is actually the basis or the very mantra of sustainable development. And in science's new contract with society, it does not just stop here. It leads us to understand that resilience building is very important. It is not just the way in which we plan and use the resources, but we should also develop resilient structures which will help us to preserve the resources apart from what we do, also bringing in nature aspect of it and bringing in other unexpected aspects of societal interactions like wars or other man-made disasters. In context, we have to know that resilience building and capacity building forms a very, very major part of this discourse. Here we see that very often resilience building means actually investing in more infrastructure, investing capital amounts into resilience building for today, which the present generation will not be able to realize. So many people don't see where this leads to. When they don't see where this leads to, they will not accept the sociological process of resilience building, right? So they see there's no use to this. So it's apparent, there is no apparent progress to the society by these processes. So they will not be accepting it. But it is nevertheless very important, because in sustainability terms, we know that preservation of the native characteristics is a very, very important justice and equitable dimension to the use of resources, especially natural resources itself. Here, the challenge now is that there is no, the investment actually can be bankrolled by certain very influential members of a society, but it may not be acceptable to the lower rungs of the society, which do not see the long-term use of these processes. So making the resilience building and economics meet, which is a very, very difficult task. And this actually brings in more complexity in planning the sustainability. So now all these factors that we have looked at, the challenges of competitive use, the challenges of evolution of science understanding or scientific communication itself, and the challenge of meeting the equity or the justice aspects, and the challenge of keeping the investments alive, all pertain to the it may fail at some points of time if the cultural space is not harnessed to make the generations and the people understand, the communities understand, that the competitive use on one hand is very much a part of their life, but the resilience building and the storage or preservation of natural systems for future is also a very important dimension that has to be considered in real time. So the cultural aspect, when we put it in a cultural space, it does not offend people, and it gives people more space to analyze and have those sort of scenario analysis, as we have seen earlier, to understand where this leads towards meeting the sustainable development goals. So here actually the cultural and the sociological process become very, very important. So also the process of evolution of science itself, because here the scientific and the cultural spaces, they are very, very important alternative spaces, if we will consider, which can actually complement the progress that a society makes. And through these mechanisms, we can actually make people envision, communities envision, that science must push towards equity in the intercultural space, in the inter and the intergenerational spaces, as well as in developing a gender neutral society, which gives considerable life experiences of peace and happiness to every individual that transcends a particular societal space. Now, the medium of science, okay, becomes very important. As we see, we have been having these discussions on how the society and culture relates to science, but actually in the constituent space of transformation, how does the science society relationships actually function? Now that we need to develop a perception of where science stands in society. In that way, if we start off our understanding, Scholl's 2017 in sustainability paper provide a very good dimension or understanding of this. So science, first of all, can function in two key spaces. Number one, it can be as a self-sufficient endeavor by itself, which means that science actually caters to specialized disciplinary work within the different streams of science. There is aeronautical science, there is actually maritime science. So these are all specialized, fields in which science functions, along, of course, with technology. We have the physics, we have the chemistry, we have the biology. We have these silos or core science silos, and we have applied science silos. For example, applied electronics, we have medical physics, which is something very, very popular these days. So here actually it caters to a self-sufficient endeavor across these core and applied areas of understanding the elements of nature and how they function. And here scientists become what are known as knowledge workers. So they contribute to society in terms of being knowledge workers, and the data that is contributed is very, very specialized or disciplinary. If we see, on the other hand, science as a lobbyist tool. Okay, so science is used for this knowledge production, and science is also used for lobbying fundamentally. So these are two ways in which science is used. If it is a lobbyist tool, it becomes a part of contract-based research on higher agglomerated social systems. So what this means is that research is given a direction to cater to specific, I would say, demands of society, but these are of a higher order. So these can't cater to the basic needs, but it can actually cater to the needs that an agglomerated society requires. For example, there can be industries which require data, specific data on certain ecological processes, which an ecologist or a group of ecologists can provide. So here it becomes a medium for a lobbyist to take this forth and present it in a way that is favorable to them. Here scientists can hence run the risk of becoming luggage carriers, and science itself runs the risk of being used only for lobbying. So there is a fundamentally useful way in which science can be used, and a fundamentally, I would say, unfavorable way in which science can be used. But both these ways will influence the way in which the society itself is evolving. So if the society, demands that science be used for creating self-awareness and for creating more resource basis for humans, versus let science be used to direct some contract based ideologies and research on use of actually man-made structures which will benefit or facilitate human development in a different way. So these are actually two contrasting scenarios that science can come up. But we know that with culture in the equation, we understand that science should cater basically to a transformational space which is of a higher order. We all actually desire that science leads us to some sort of elevation, some sort of transition, right? So here, science as a medium for transition, it can be agent which tells us that now the resource is X, and if we have to achieve 2X, we have to transform in this way so that all the societies there achieve 2X progress. So this is actually a transitioning phase that science can help to lead us by pinpointing very specifically ways in which cultural practices, social practices can reduce the wastage and increase the output. So here scientists can what be known as multidisciplinary workers. They can be termed in one sense as activists who lead this this movement of change. Also, science will influence the transition process itself by giving specific inputs in the form of strategies, right? So if we change, for example, the ways in which there was a very interesting observation recently, where the stubble burning effect was critically reviewed. So what the farmers said was that if they put the if they were asked to delay the stubble burning by some months, so that they can conserve the groundwater. Otherwise, the groundwater was being used in a larger fashion when stubble burning caused dryness of the atmosphere and dryness of the soil as well. So drying up of the soil led to loss of soil moisture. So they had increased use of water in the subsequent season. So if they could delay the stubble burning until the time that it was closer to the monsoon season, then soil moisture could be preserved. This was one idea that was put forth, but it was not very functional because there were other factors related to air quality which worsened the situation. If it was, for example, the trapping or the inversion layer closer to the monsoon season, it trapped the pollutants more, and it gave rise to very critical health quality issues. So these are scenarios actually which are examined in terms of strategies. But the strategy and planning and policy making can be very specific, which need to be actually critically assessed by science for various parameters of change and transformation. And in this way, if we come across the best solution to some of the existing issues at local, regional, or global levels, then scientists from a transdisciplinary point of view coming together, for example, of scientists who study air quality, who study water quality and soil quality together, they can actually, in this particular example, act as catalysts of change. And otherwise also, these transformational spaces can be analyzed critically by the scientists to bring about these changes. So scientists can also be catalysts in that sense. And finally, a higher level of understanding of science as a public good helps us to understand that there is a theoretical and a practical basis for using of resources, which helps us to build the democratic and the flexible and sustainable pathways to achieving development in societies. So here we see that the theoretical basis is given by the scientific data sets, and the practical use is determined by the socio-cultural practices. So the equity part basically comes from the value and the judgmental aspects of psychology and anthropology and sociology put together. So here scientists, they even these days we understand that scientists doesn't mean only those who do science, but also those who do social science. So scientists on the whole can be reflective facilitators of this process of transition itself. So now we see that a higher transformational space means the relationship between science and society should be close knit. Then only we can achieve what is known as transition management through observational and very appropriate transitioning processes, and also as realizing the value of the science that we have gone through as a system, as a society, as a part of a very important public good inventory. So here we see if we look at the way in which the global movements has actually facilitated this transitioning of human societies. We know that 2015 to present, when the SDG Sustainable Development Goals actually were promulgated and came into existence, the UN's 2030 agenda has been a very key aspect of planning and strategizing of human societies across the globe. So here, the SDG, the agenda of the 2030 SDGs, it stresses the fundamental role that the science should play in implementing these goals, and it is endorsed by the global community, which means that the socio-cultural understanding or the context have been normalized to a certain extent, so that across the globe all communities accept that the 2030 agenda is one unique way of achieving sustainability. But at present, the question is how can and should researchers respond to the societal demand on science? So society asks, tell me the way how we can achieve sustainability. So in the near future, with whatever are the sociological and the scientific processes going on, there has to be a systematic engagement with the normative dimension of this agenda. Normative is something which is practical or realizable. the fundamentally realizable dimensions that are put forth by science or the scientific community. So that in futuristic sense of time, the production of knowledge will be relevant to sustainable development itself. It will not actually be on achieving industrial progress, or it will not be on achieving monetary rich, the number of billionaires may not increase over time, but we will look more at the sustainable development aspects more and more through the formation of goals and strategies and plans which will help us to achieve this. So this actually is dictated in the cultural space by how people consume the scientific data and react to the scientific data and use the scientific information to plan their own lives on a sustainable basis and contribute to a community of sustainable lives, those who live sustainable lifestyles. So here we see sociological inquiries become very important. The first inquiry we should, a society should reflect on is unraveling and reflecting on the ethical values which are associated with sustainability. That is why I said that any means of achieving growth can be fine, it can be accepted, but what is the value that is involved should reflect on the ethical values which are involved in achieving that sustainability. Here, the values and valuation of stakeholders who are very relevant, they have a relevant say in which the society itself evolves. The values with respect to the sustainability discourses between these stakeholders, the way in which we take cognizance of the power issues which are present within the society, and also correlate this with actual philosophical foundations to achieve the sociological element. These constitute the sociological approach to achieving sustainability within this sphere of reflecting on the ethical values. Now, anthropology and history can contribute the data sets which are very essential for us to understand this process from historical to modern context. But the methodological approach will be to combine social sciences, political science, and humanities, along with the data, scientific data on the status of change with respect to the stakeholder population itself to achieve sustainability. So this is a very complex, it may look like a complex methodology, but it is a simplified procedure in which value system or ethical values can be incorporated into sustainability planning. The second way is to question which sustainability values will guide the research into linking actual science, society, economy, and environment. Now, the first step we actually came up with the list of ethical values that need to be considered. Here we are selecting those values which will help us to achieve the triple bottom line along with societal progress. Here actually, the values which are described in scientific literature also become important. This is another way of telling that it is not just the human element which is important, but it is also the nature's element which is important in our discourse on sustainability. And development cannot happen at the cost of destruction of habitats. That is the idea, that is a value that scientific literature puts forth. Okay, so here the values now have to be defined by what are known as legitimate social actors. Cutting down tribal settlements, to create highways can be a very good example, a way in which in real time it becomes a very complex process to attach values which are legitimate with respect to the societal actors themselves. For example, the tribal communities can feel that there can be various scenarios. One scenario could be that they feel that they are already existing in harmony with nature and they should not be disturbed. On the other hand, because of the influence of urbanizing societies, they can feel that they are required to have the development around their settlement, so that the way in which they don't want to be isolated, as in the Paro Taksang monastery that we saw. They don't want to be isolated like that. They want to interface more with the urbanizing society and the cities and the towns, so that more of goods transfers takes place. Economically, they become more settled, so they can demand that value to their own lives as in the discourse of a development. So here actually the identifying the legitimate social actors, and also there can be politicians or middlemen who pose these ideas as though they were the tribal people's perspective. It is possible that such a scenario also exists. There can be middlemen who they have to be judged whether they are actually legitimate social actors in this sociological process itself. So here actually values of different stakeholder groups, the values of the legitimate societal actors, and the values according to science, all three need to be taken together in a scientific and cultural approach. With the methodological approach to achieve this would be a interdisciplinary and a disciplinary approach, which will address the sustainability issues at large within any given human society. So here actually we are seeing the economic approach takes precedence and guides the way in which the society addresses or consumes the scientific and the cultural scientific data and the cultural spaces to achieve sustainability. There is another goal that we have to think about, that is finding the common ground. Okay, so each society can have its own needs and wants, but as I told you, there is the element of tolerance and there is an element of adaptation and coexistence, which is very specific to sustainability. Only then sustainability on a larger scale can be achieved. Here actually the process becomes transdisciplinary. It is no longer confined only to science. It's also transdisciplinary and goes over to the sociological realm, onto the anthropological realm, also the historical realm. Here the participatory problem framing takes the focus. So now actually we can even middlemen in a way can be considered as stakeholders, because they are dependent on analyzing the socio-cultural processes to an extent and interpreting it in the correct way to achieve sustainability. So the problem framing should actually target the issues in the society as a whole. That is, the sociology only can contribute to this understanding, and sociology only also can tell what would be the appropriate vision that has to be developed for any specific human society. So here the social learning and social knowledge gathering and experiential knowledge gathering become very, very important in deliberation and co-production of knowledge. Finally, the reflexive clarification of the researcher's own normative and epistemological ground, because data collection is happening at different levels, from the scientific level, from the stakeholder level, from the societal actors level, and also from the administrative or the political level. So here, every person's own normative angle, okay, the ground in which they do the judgment of and analyze the scenarios and undertake those activities need to be questioned. Here also socio-cultural approaches take the forefront, where the individual and disciplinary values and understanding of the knowings become very, very important, as also the methodological approach of self-reflection and social learning within and beyond the academia. So here the ethics of science again comes into the fold. Now we see that the cycle is complete. From where we began to where we are now, we have covered the whole ground of interactions between social, cultural, scientific, and economic spaces, where the socio-cultural approach becomes very, very critical part of these relationships. So now we know that transdisciplinary processes through the eyes of the administrators lead what are known as sustainability investigations, and assessment of these will give rise to our understanding of what resilient structures need to be incorporated. And scientists are very important about the concept of sustainability, so are the artists. They are going to put forth another dimension to it. So this will help us to continue the sociological and the cultural assessment of sustainability on the normative achievement of the goals of equity and justice. So here actually we are trying to manage what are the system limits within which the society can function harmoniously. Now, if we move on, having understood these, our goal now to focus on our goal is to focus on sustainable societies. Now, we all have an idea through our past experiences, through our social memories, through our understanding of, how we should style our lives around sustainability, that we all have our own dreams of sustainable futures. But what is the overall dream? Okay, there's some examples, very interesting examples shown in this particular picture. For example, from the mobility angle, a sustainable society is expected to use more electric vehicles, right? And consume more of less of fossil fuels and optimize on that part. Whereas it will be from a food point of view, it might turn out that the vegetarian food can become more of a sustainable food option than what is available at present. So these are all actually some dreams, which uh, a sort of a scenario analysis that has evolved out of studies of human communities, which dictate or visualize how the society should be sustainable in future. This is apart from the 2030 UN agenda. This actually is more on the creative level, how we envisage how a sustainable society will be. But we have to understand that each of this comes at the cost of development, and development comes at the cost of environment, which will help us to delay one or more of these goals in future. Or we also have to understand that the human element will change this in multiple ways, because the focus can be very differential across different global societies. One global society may be concerned more about using more of less of pesticides, or less of nutrients in the soil, synthetic nutrients in the soil for to do agriculture. But another society can be more concerned with lessening the use of single-use plastics, and also improving the blue-green infrastructure in the urban cities. So that also depends on how the economic structure revolve around these efforts. So here actually we understand that the assessment itself, apart from what we want to achieve, also is dependent on actually two types of frameworks. One is the focal point analysis framework, where a certain issue or a sustainability issue is focused, and the society tries to deliberate around this focal issue. But there can also be distal network impacts, which are put together from sort of a top-down approach to converge to a point where a society discusses what it wants as a sustainability goal. So here are the policies of how these frameworks are adopted across the global societies, that also change from a national to a transformational level, because although globally it is agreed that the climates, the goals related to lessening the effects of climate change, lessening the effects of land degradation, achieving land degradation neutrality, these are very important. The policies that each of these adopt actually is different, because they are informed by different data sets. The national data sets for different countries are different. The statewide data sets are different. So there are still challenges in forecasting how a human society will assimilate the data, which will lead to its formulation of policies for sustainable development. Here, the normative or the translational aspect is very, very important, because the value systems that each of these societies plays are also different. Just to put this into perspective, there's a very nice, cartoon here, which talks about, it's actually a conference of climate change, climate science deniers, who say that, there is no climate change happening. But scientific data dictates otherwise. So here, to what extent the involved data, the technologies, and the frameworks we'll reinforce the idea that climate change is indeed happening. Is it, first we have to, as a society, question, is it correct that we are assuming, or are we assuming that climate change is happening? If it's really happening, then how do we manage it, and what are the best or the good practices which will help us to achieve climate resilience? So these are the different levels, or the normative levels, or the translational levels of the task, which also the society has to go through from a socio-cultural context, just to accept the very basic fact, the truth, and also to build the measures to adapt to this, either, or to overcome this through different levels of co-evolution. So here actually it is very important, as from a sociological point of view, to examine every scientific issue at large. Having spoken at length about how society and cultural spaces function along with science in the realm of sustainability, now we are going to look at some examples. So the first example you're seeing here is a very, very interesting example. You can see the larger picture here actually is a picture of a temple for water. Okay, so this was a Sumerian temple for water. Sumerians are ancient civilization again, and this actually temple is a remnant which was discovered in, you can see actually Sumeria, it's near the the Tigris river in Egypt. Here you can see that the Sumerian civilization left behind this particular structure, which is known as Abzu, or the temple of subterranean waters. Okay, and the presiding deity of this temple, you can see on your right hand side, is somebody known as Enki. Incidentally, Enki is the lord attributed to knowledge production, creativity, grains or storages of food, and also naughtiness. Okay, so here actually Enki, the larger dimension of Enki is as the lord of water himself, who provides knowledge creation, who provides for food, who provides the creativity, and also as the god of naughtiness. So here you see the socio-cultural spaces and the normative angles are very beautifully defined in a religious setting of an ancient civilization, which appropriated this space to construct structures which will conserve water. So here actually they said that the community values here are towards actually building structures to conserve water in places where the evaporation is very, very high, as they have experienced, so that the normal activities on the top right hand corner, you can see that the multitude of activities that are going around it's actually a visualization through historical records and understanding of the history, how the activities surrounding this particular Abzu temple must have happened in earlier periods, right? So there was so much of economic activity going on. There's so much of socio-cultural exchanges. So it is relevant for us to understand that from a natural element point of view, from taking the example of water, that actually precipitates discussions on how this particular natural resource is used by its people. Moving on, another very good example is that we first spoke about the underground water, okay, conserving underground water or fresh water. Now we are looking at a structure called Seahenge. This is actually present at the East Anglican coast, and it is dated to be about close to 4,000 years ago. And this actually, you can see, it's a ring of rocks which are placed in the shore in a circle, which is described in a book by Miller, The Golden Thread of Time. He says that these were actually water observatories which are set up near the coast to predict time. Okay, so this was the way in which the civilization itself looked at, or harnessed or lived with the ocean. We have heard of, Stonehenge, but we have never heard of Seahenge till now. Seahenges were actually very, very typical observatories, which also catered to, how the humans had a relationship with the sea. So now we see that water in different dimensions influenced civilizations to produce different sort of technologies in association with them to use these technologies, and it helped them to achieve the life processes or the goals of their society or social progresses in different ways. So before Sehenge, there may not have been a mechanism to predict time at that particular area or region. So with the Sehenge, that was definitely a very big development. In the earlier example we saw, this is a very particular way in which the architectural engineering contributed to water conservation in very multitude of ways, and it also helped to have a rich economic landscape established surrounding this temple itself. So that was also a sociological process which was enhanced through the cultural and the scientific planning or strategizing perspective. Moving on closer to home, we know that the Taj Mahal itself is considered a very good observatory. Again, this was actually, it's not just an architectural wonder, or it is not just a big cultural space, but it was also actually the cypress trees which you can see here, they were used actually to report time in the resolution of minutes. So that was a very big advancement. It decided how this ancient place was used. It decided how people should go about their religious aspects, how they would go about setting up the markets, how would the transportation in this region happen. So this was something that was very a rich landscape which provided or cater to different aspects of development and progress. Definitely having a control on the time would have had a constraint on the activities, which definitely would have had a handle on how sustainable or unsustainable practices were. Okay, to certain extent we cannot judge what the earlier or the historical population did or not do, but we can actually assume very safely that when there is always a sense of time, we try to optimize well, right? So from that aspect, culture and society become very important aspects, which also dictate how sustainably we are using resources. Another very good example comes from Hampi. Here on your right top corner, you can see that a variety of aqueducts were built using stones. Okay, so this was also a height of architectural expertise and architectural marvel, which is still functional even today. Some of the aqueducts have been silted, but most of them are still functional, and they carry river from the water from the river Tungabhadra to distal agricultural fields. So it was planned in such a way. You can see a step well here, the royal step well. These were all interconnected to a system of water tanks, canals, temples, and enclosures, which actually was at the height of water management at that point in time. And it is still an example, a lesson for the modern generation to build such structures which are sustainable over long periods of time. So here, not just from the material footprint point of view, but also from the energy point of view, it becomes very rational for us to look at history, to look at culture, and to look at, learn from these experiences, how these aqueducts, building these architectural marvels actually help also to elevate water transmission at higher levels, which was not done earlier. So we actually only have canals which are dug on the ground, or there are some tanks which store water on the ground, but these were actually elevated aqueducts which were built in earlier times, and they are existing today as proofs or evidences for that type of progress that a society had undertaken to make itself more sustainable. Another example from Mexico, if we will see, is a very nice example of this lake system. So these are co-lake systems. You can see that one part of this lake where Tenochtitlan is there. So there is actually a bridge there which divides the two parts of a lake. One part, Texcoco, is a brackish water system, and the Chalco system is a freshwater system. The beauty is that this whole lake, okay, in central Mexico is an endorite basin. Endorite means it's isolated. It is not connected to any other system. So whatever of the brackish water nature is developed there, or the freshwater nature is developed in situ there. So because of that, the ancient Aztecs who existed in these places, they built what are known as causeways. These are made actually through natural materials, through reeds and floating vegetation which are found in the brackish water parts of the lake itself. By building these causeways, they divided this lake into two halves where they could actually conserve the freshwater parts to manage their water stress scenarios by themselves. So here actually they also pioneered in one specific type of agriculture called the Chinampa agriculture, which were Chinampas were actually floating islands of agricultural plots, which they populated in one part of the lake, and they actually carried out this agriculture. So here actually they found a way through civilizational evolution that they could found a way for effective water and energy food nexus to be existing in a big lake of an area of several hundred square kilometers, where they could harmoniously use both the brackish and the freshwater portions and still, ensure food security for their own communities. So here again is a very, very good example that we come across from history, and which also is very, very motivating for us, which actually lets us look at the present Loktak Lake in India itself. We have a pioneer there, Vijay Shanti, who makes, what is known as lotus silk by harnessing the lotus which are floating in these Loktak Lake. She turns them into silk yarn. This is actually called sustainable silk, and it's being promoted largely from the Northeast. It is a very a thing of a big pride for us also to know that despite the competitive use scenarios that we have come across, we know that actually sharing of natural resources through use of modern or traditional technologies can be very helpful in transitioning into sustainable societies. So here actually we can see the craftsmanship that this person exhibits is very, very, very critical for us to connect the natural resources management with sustainable transitioning and sustainable pathways, and also to use the system without polluting it or without degrading it. Loktak itself is pride of India in many different ways. We also have the same floating island concept here and floating agriculture happening here. So there is a picture which shows these how this is done within this lake. So it is a very beautiful way in which transition can be helpful, and human society itself can be benefited by adopting these approaches within the framework of sustainability. So with this, we also have to now move on into the modern era. So here, the obvious question that many people ask is, the human intelligence only way to achieve this higher consciousness? No, because we are also in competition with artificial intelligence these days, and artificial intelligence use cultural data to plan sustainability. So, but it is still uncertain whether these can be based on the same ethical background as a human intelligence would do, right? So the cultural, an example here, you can see there are mugshots of 4 different convicts in the US. There is a case actually, it's called the Stanford Prison Experiment case, wherein a software which was developed by a company called North Point was used to assess the risk of these convicts for future, criminal activities. And interestingly, it was very biased because each of these were based on the cultural data sets, and the scores were developed based on the cultural and ethnicity and the background of these prisoners, but did not correlate with actual risk that they pose. The basic thing was that the blacks in the picture, they were deemed to be of higher risk as criminals compared to the whites here. But in reality, the whites turned out to be more, the better criminals, I should say, than the blacks themselves. So the racial aspect, understanding ethnicity or racial aspect without human intelligence and relying only on data sets or cultural data can be very, very negative ways in which the society can transition. So here the success rates are very low if we actually don't have an understanding basically of the human psychology aspects itself. And prediction will fail only if AI is used based on standalone data sets. It can be cultural data sets also, but will it be fair and effective is still very important and critical aspect of social decision making that is being explored, and it is still evolving. In another contrasting way, there are actually games of sustainability which are considered as new social experimental spaces where people are allowed to make sustainability part of their lives by employing in games and simulations. Okay, so the new gaming experiences are targeted towards co-creation of social spaces and simulations to advance sustainable living, where also there are some newer concepts like promoting the use of new currencies such as eco coins, which are actually part of the simulations, eco coins and wellness tokens, which will incentivize what we know as far-sighted behavior, because far-sightedness is a very important element of sustainability. It is not just the short-term gains. The only way I see that this can be effective is if it is done as a collective game, having again an individual component to these game spaces, and as individual social experiments can give us important insights and data sets into how people think about sustainability. But to achieve sustainability again will be a question, because achieving will only be done together. So here the transformation space should not isolate the individual players, but as a whole, as a community, this can provide some sort of modern ways in which, or modern cultural spaces in which people can come together and understand how sustainability processes can be effective over longer periods in time. So these are some very fun filled or very light ways in which sustainability itself is being taken up as a discourse in modern societies. So having had these sort of examples put into perspective, I think that at the end of this discussion, we can understand that we can use culture for sustainability and to